Welcome back to Pen to Pod. On this episode, I talk with Camri Kohler, who is the author of Peachy and the sequel, Paired. I actually found Camri because I have been following Lake Country Press for quite some time, and they are a small press and have been publishing really, really amazing books. I read Peachy. I was instantly drawn in by Camri's ability to write characters that feel so real. And as someone who loves urban fantasy and fantasy set in contemporary worlds, Peachy just scratched all the itches I want, when I'm reading. And I knew I had to talk to Camri when I set out to start this podcast. Camri Kohler was raised by a welder and a Jack Mormon in the small town of Wallsburg. She worked her way up to the grid city Salt Lake. Camri earned her bachelor's degree in English from the University of Utah before completing her master's of Library and Information Science at the University of Illinois. Camri is an archivist at PBS Utah and spends her free time with her partner, her dogs, and her tomatoes. She has a mess of unresolved issues, which are the primary inspiration for her writing. I love this bio, and we talk all about where Camri's from, how it influences her writing, all of the unresolved issues, and how her characters have them as well, which is why they are so believable. I highly suggest picking up Peachy. Peachy is about this 23-year-old surly and slightly tipsy Frankie who finds her hag of a grandmother dead on the sofa, and her best friend, Ben Bowen, introduces her to the magical underbelly of Aspen Ridge, Utah. And if that hasn't intrigued you yet, just listen to our conversation and I'm sure you'll be picking up Peachy by the end of it.
You're like the fourth author I've interviewed from Utah.
Oh, that's so crazy. Actually, there are a lot of writers here, but I do
Yeah.
think for some reason or another, it might be like having to do with Brandon Sanderson at BYU. But I feel like because I have an agent, so like my agent lives in the UK, but I have an agent sibling who lives in Orem, Utah, like an hour from me, which is so crazy.
Whoa.
And he writes sci-fi and like high fantasy stuff. And I
Okay.
think that the fantasy especially is like the most popular genre, if not like
Yeah.
nonfiction in Utah. And I think, yeah, I've never been like a big high fantasy person. It's so I like it to be in real places just for like
Mm-hmm.
to get some grounding. I don't know if I would ever write something like that, but it's impressive and it is very popular in
It
Utah for
is.
some reason. Yeah.
Yeah, that's funny. I never thought about like the Sanderson effect. He's like attracting a ton of sci-fi fantasy writers
And
there
whenever I
because I've
tell
watched all his
people,
stuff on
yeah,
YouTube.
and I've read Mistborn, which was awesome. It took me forever though,
Mm-hmm.
but I did read it. I loved it. But every time I tell anyone that I write books, they're always like, "Brandon Sanderson, you must love Brandon Sanderson. He's from Utah too." And I'm like, I do like him, but I had never read him until I'd already written a few books by then. And even then, it
Right.
was because a friend told me or bought the book for me and said it's great.
Yeah.
It was great. I just usually don't do high fantasy because I just don't have the patience or the brain power to remember all the made up words and locations and things like that.
I totally get that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like I love high fantasy, but I have to be in the mood. It has to be
Yeah,
like the right place at the right time for me, or I
totally.
will just completely put it down and put it away.
You gotta have a hungry brain to be like, I'm ready
Yes.
to jump into this. But that's only happened to me a couple of rare instances. And sci-fi is almost never. I just can't process
Yeah.
it. I don't know what's wrong with me. But you know what? We can do some fantasy, some sci-fi stuff, but like let's do it in San Francisco or something like that. That's where I
I
land for
agree.
sure.
That's what I'm writing right now too, is like an urban fantasy technically is the genre. And I'm
Yeah.
always hungry for like more
There's not a lot.
contemporary fantasies.
Yeah, it's a weird and I think it's an unfortunate situation and that urban fantasy was really popular in like the early 2000s and then it
Mm-hmm.
kind of fell out of popularity and now you can't find like I remember when I was looking for an agent, yeah, I couldn't find anyone that represented urban fantasy. And then I found somebody who says that now it's better to call it contemporary fantasy that gets
Yeah.
people more interested, but urban fantasy is almost just the term in itself. an outdated term, and that's why it's, but when I was querying, I went urban fantasy, and no one was interested in it. And then once I started calling it contemporary fantasy or horror blended with
Interesting.
fantasy, and it was the same book, but then people started getting more interested in it for sure. It's weird.
It is weird. It's, a lot of traditional publishing in general will kind of like mark a trend as dead.
Yeah.
So I do feel like the urban fantasy like died at the end of Twilight craze
Yeah. And like City of
and City of
Bones
Bones.
mhm,
Yep.
was the big one. And I love that book too. And
I
it's
was
just,
obsessed with that series.
yeah, it's like, I'm like, this is like the world that I love where you could be like, my world could be magical and I just don't know. That's what I always loved about it.
Yes.
I do think it's coming back because I've heard that things are kind of trending more like towards werewolves and stuff again a little
Mm-hmm.
bit. And with that, I feel like werewolves go very hand in hand with like an urban fantasy situation. So maybe it'll,
Agree.
because things always come back, and I think it's gonna have an uprising because romantasy has been the thing for like
Mm-hmm.
10 years. And I think it's going to fall out of popularity a little bit, particularly because TikTok had such a huge push towards the romantasy genre, which was awesome. But now TikTok A might be going away. But B, I've
Right.
also seen so many book talkers actually, which is so sad. They're just like, me, myself included, don't have a ton of energy to post book talk content
Yeah.
anymore with personal things, with global things, national things. It's just been like so exhausting. And so I think without like the book talkers there to constantly push romantasy, particularly, but other genres too, it might fall out of style a little bit. And we might go back to things like we were
Yeah.
looking at in high school at just like a local library and stuff.
Yeah, and I do feel like, global events like affect what people are reading. And for some reason, 2008, housing crisis, we were all really into dystopian
Yeah,
fiction and paranormal romance and things. So,
those were good
yeah, everything's
times.
cyclical.
Yeah.
That was
I was the
nice.
same way. Yeah, I was a sophomore in high school, and so I would just hunker down. I think I read the Twilight series probably like 4 times in that one year, as well as City of Bones, Hunger Games, obviously. But then like there were so many paranormal
So
romance
many.
books that I can barely remember now, like Fallen or like Beautiful Creatures, I think was one, and like Hush Hush, all of them, and they were
Yes.
basically the same story. But I loved every single one of them. And I bought all of them, and I still have them.
So we are the contemporary fantasy authors who were obsessed with these books as kids. This was our
Yes,
pipeline. Yes,
this
this
is
is
our
our
niche,
destiny.
and people like it.
Exactly.
But yeah, it really didn't get like people didn't seem as interested in it until I started calling it horror fantasy
Oh,
rather
that's
than
interesting.
urban fantasy. Yeah, I don't know.
Wow.
But and my agent was the one who specifically told me to not call it urban fantasy because the term was
Mm,
outdated. Even if it's the
yeah.
same plot devices, the same environments, it does. Yeah, it just like people are saying this is a person kind of, which I that was the first book I wrote, so admittedly I was out of touch, but some agents told me that just by not knowing the updated terms, I was out of touch.
Wow,
But
yeah.
yeah, and it's just hard when you're because I've also like I just went through a small press and I didn't get an agent for a long time. And the small press loved it, but I pitched it to them as a horror fantasy. I didn't know about any of these things because I wasn't even on like Twitter or anything. I was just writing a book because I loved writing and I just wanted to publish it. And I learned so many things along the way. Like you had to have a Twitter and you had to do pitch events and you had to get your community of writer friends and you needed to critique each other's query letters. And I didn't do any of that. I was just like, this is, I can just write a book, print it out, and mail it like they do in the movies, and they'll love
Right?
it. Yeah.
Yeah. Put it in the big yellow envelope, write it
Yes.
what it is on the front, and
It'll
send
be
it
like in the
off.
proposal. They're going to love it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Publishing is so misrepresented in the media. It's insane. It gave me so much false hope. So many people, they write a book in an insane amount of time. And the first draft gets picked up and then it's published within like 2 months. It's out on bookshelves. And I'm like, what? I remember that happened in Family Guy. And Family Guy is obviously a cartoon, but I was like, this isn't real. Like, you're tricking me. And I was more upset about that than like the fact that a dog had written a book. I was more upset about like, you guys aren't getting it right. It takes a really long
Right.
time.
Yeah, but it's true. Like a lot of people's first impressions with publishing is the media. And like you said, if you aren't online, you don't realize like, oh shoot, I need a Twitter, I need a writing group, I need all this stuff. So that is what you're looking at. You're like, oh, okay, this can be done in 2 months. If you don't really look into it and realize the harsh reality. But also when you look into it, the information's not that easy to find
True.
either.
And because I realized I was missing out on so much information, I bought a book that was about how to get into the publishing industry, and it was so outdated too. Like it was still
Mm,
doing like you can either email it in or print it out and send it, which that is not a thing anymore. And it also was like physically mailed newsletters type of situation. So the book was also not
yeah.
helpful. It just seems like the publishing industry is constantly changing, which is insane considering it takes so long to put a book out. My friend just got a book deal and it's coming out in 2026, like in the summer. So it takes, which is awesome, but it's
Wow.
like a year and a half, 2 years just to get everything done. Not even including like when you go on submission with your book and editors look at it, and that can take years. It's like, it's a long process.
Yes.
So I remember I told my husband, I was like, I'm gonna get a book deal, and I don't care if I'm like 60 years old, because I know everything's gonna take long, but it is gonna happen eventually. But now I'm hoping to get so I love the fantasy still, but I'm now definitely leaning towards like standalone horror stuff. So I have two books on submission right now with my agent that are just standalone horrors, and I'm writing another standalone. But just because writing a trilogy, I learned is very hard to
Mhm.
like you just like your brain doesn't want to keep, well, I'm sure some people they can just keep going back and never get tired of it, but I have all like these other ideas and these other characters, and I just want to start fresh. And especially if you get stuck and you're like on book 2 or on book 3 and you like can't think of how to push past that writer's block, it just seems like you're never going to finish the book, and just start
Right.
falling further and further behind. And that's kind of where I am right now. I took a long hiatus, like a 6-month hiatus, and now I'm getting back into writing again. And I had like 50,000 words that I forgot I even wrote, but now I hate. And I have to fix, turn it into a real book, and then go through that long, long process again. It's just
Yes.
like, it takes some tough people to get in this industry for sure. It's a lot of waiting and a lot of hard work and a lot of hating your own stuff and still trying to
Yeah.
work on it. Even though like this is trash, but I will guess I'll spend all night fixing it.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a sticky note on my wall that is just written in like huge letters of it's like right over here. And it just says, it's allowed to suck. Like it's allowed to
Yes.
suck. It can
Yes.
suck. And it sucks that we have to remember that it's allowed to suck, but
True.
it
I
is
mean, I
hard.
used to always like it wasn't until this book probably that I realized that it's allowed to suck, just because now I'm like, you just need to push through and get to the end. Whereas before I would edit as I went, even though there all the advice says don't do that. Yeah, like finish and then go back and edit. I would not do it. I would, if ever I had writer's block, I would go back and edit instead and hope it like started things turning again. But it would end up taking, I would end up changing everything, changing characters. Like Peachy originally was not an urban fantasy. It was a dystopian book, and it had a totally
Wow.
different main character, and it was like more of a global catastrophe rather than like a personal journey. And it just happened from me like constantly going back and re-editing. And then I'd be like, you know what? I don't even like this character anymore because I've read them 4,000 times and we're going to change it. So it ended up
That's
working
so
out. But
interesting. That's a
yeah,
huge shift,
I
too.
would not recommend doing that.
Yeah.
I've learned a
Caution.
lot in the last, because I started writing originally when the pandemic hit,
Mhm.
because I was like feeling not nearly productive enough and I was getting these like guilty feelings if I wasn't doing enough all the time. So I wrote a book, and I would send the first 5 chapters to everyone in my family. And then I would go back, reread them, find typos and things I didn't like, fix it, and send it again before they could even read it. And then they would have just like 15 emails from me, like, don't read this one, read this one.
Now that you've done all of this, if writing or editing is your favorite part.
Oh, editing 100,000%. a hundred
Me
thousand
too.
percent.
Me too.
I'm drafting is hard. It is so hard
Yes.
to make something out of nothing. It's so much easier to polish something than to make something out of nothing. And I
Yes.
feel like I have a bit of an editor brain as it is.
Mhm.
I edit court transcripts sometimes as like a side hustle too. So, and that kind of I think inhibits the flow of creativity a little bit, in that I'm always thinking like
Yeah.
technically about a sentence, or if a word works or what a word would work better, and like this is just clunky, and I will just like unpack a sentence for 40 minutes. And like, if I could just let the creative juices flow and be like, he's in the room. That's all we need to know right now. And we're moving on.
I feel that. I always explain like editing me, like draft 2 plus me is the best because I'm like making pottery. Like I'm spinning on the wheel, I'm changing things up. We might be smashing it down and building it back up again. But like drafting is harvesting clay. I don't know why. But yeah, putting words on a blank page is like the worst thing, which is hilarious because I'm a writer, but I'd rather have the words and
Yes.
then make it better.
100%. And I wish I could just like follow your posted example and being like, it's allowed to suck. And even it's not
Right.
allowed to be like, it's totally allowed to not be the most creative, artistic, beautiful sentence. Like it can just be
Yes.
stating what's happening and you can go back later. But I can't do that. I'm like, this sentence sucks, and I will think, and it will get me stuck, and I won't be able to finish writing. And so drafting takes me so long just because I'll write a
Yeah.
paragraph, not feel inspired by it, even though it's just depicting events or a character or whatever, and then I'll stop. And it takes forever. Whereas if I'm editing, I'm just like, I am gliding like an ice skater through time. And it's getting better every single time. I love editing. It's my favorite part. If I could just draft in the same attitude I edit, I would have like 12 books finished a year.
Well, I love that. I love that I found a kindred spirit who also loves editing and contemporary fantasy. That's so
Yes.
exciting.
But because I have another friend who is writing urban fantasy, and it really is seeming like trends might start turning. I'm very hopeful because I think if it started trending, because right now it's so hard to write a whole book and then be told
Hmm.
like this is a great book, but it's not marketable in the current shifting trends. That's because I got that a lot when I wrote it. And it's now so it's like going through 6 months, a year, more 2 years writing a book, and then just learning that it's not because it's bad, it's just because it's a bad time for your genre is really
Yeah.
heartbreaking. So I don't think I would dip into fantasy at all until the types of fantasy that I'm interested in are like guaranteed to be picked up, because it is tough
Hmm.
getting told that like loved it, I don't know who I'd sell it to type of situation. But that like this year is now like more and more is coming out. Whereas in 2020 it was all about romantasy. But I do, it seems like it's shifting for sure. It's just like there was an over, I think, saturation in the market. And now
Right.
things are starting to change. Yeah. But now
And
I do horror.
horror, yeah, is like on the upswing. Like that is a trend. I
It's
feel
having a moment for
it's
sure.
having a moment. It's a
Yeah.
lot of like introspective horror. I interviewed Rachel Kitch, who's in Utah. I
Yeah,
don't know if you
I
know
just
her.
followed her on Blue Sky. That is so crazy.
I was like, one of the Utah authors, and
Yes.
she has a book coming out that is horror. And we talked all about this like new era of horror that's happening where people are writing stories not jump scare, not like Stephen King
Right.
it horror, but more like get out horror. Like
Yeah.
the horrors of
Societal,
humanity.
psychological, 100%.
Yeah.
And it is good. A lot of it is so weird too, which I love. Like
Yes.
we got a lot of cosmic horror that's great. And I've never been a cosmic horror fan until I started reading all this new stuff that's coming out, and it is just so good
Hmm.
and it's so weird. And I'm like, what sort of brain do these people have to think of these monsters and these crises and this
Right.
nothingness? And it's gorgeous. And also there's a lot of women that are writing horror now that wasn't as much a movement a while ago, and it's just all so good. Like it's this the
Yes.
most delicious horror I've ever read. Stephen King I love too, but and even though he's obviously a master, I just feel like it's hard to explain. Like it's like horror now is like juicy. Like it's like
Yeah.
gross about it, and there's something really
It's
visceral
a lot of
about it.
body horror.
Yes,
A
and I'm
lot
a
of body
fan.
horror.
I am a fan.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also see Big Swiss behind you, which is
Yeah, I'm reading
a
this right now.
fantastic book. I
It's
loved
going
Big
great.
Swiss.
Yes, I'm like halfway through, and I just read Lessons in Chemistry, which I thought was going to be so boring.
Hmm.
I got it because it was like book of the year and it was so beautiful, and I was like, I'll
Yeah.
probably read it eventually. And because I'm so used to reading horror, speculative fiction, or anything like that, that I was like, oh, a woman in the 60s that wants to go into science, it just sounds so normal. And it was one of the best books I've read in a very long time, so I highly recommend it to everyone. It was very normal, but it was kind of horrifying in its normalcy, just
Mm.
in women getting into science in the 60s, which I knew was kind of going to happen, but it was very emotional, and I could not put it down. I was so wonderfully surprised. But Big Swiss is kind of the gross, juicy stuff, and I am all for
Yeah. Yeah. I was like, speaking of gross, juicy stuff, I see Big Swiss.
fun. Yeah,
That
it's
is
a
it.
fun one.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
In
really,
a
really fun.
horrifying way, certainly.
Yeah. It's fun in a not great way, but
Yeah.
it's fun to read.
Huh. Yes, that's a perfect way to describe it.
So you said you started writing Peachy then in 2020. Were you always a writer, always writing, or kind of what switched to have you writing Peachy?
In college, I majored in English when in my undergrad, and I specialized in modernism, but also poetry. So I wrote a lot of poetry, and so I wrote a book of poetry that I originally tried to submit to publishers myself without an agent when I was in like 2017 or so. And it never got picked up, and so I just stopped for a while. But then in 2019, even before the pandemic, I had this internship as a grad student, and I would just be kind of going through old tapes from like news stations, and just like logging them in a system. And it would take a lot of autopilot stuff, and I would just be sitting there while things transferred and things like that. And then I just started taking notes on my phone when I had an idea in like 2019, and I thought like one day I might try to write it, but I always thought being an author wasn't a realistic dream to have. So I thought like poetry was something that I could write quickly and could publish. Even if it didn't make a lot of money, I could still do it as like a almost like a hobby that maybe people would take seriously eventually. But writing a book definitely is like a commitment that I had to do, and I was just like, being an author is never going to happen for me. Like I just don't have it. And then when I started writing it, and I was, regardless of whether I had it or didn't have it, I was just like, this is something that I love to do. It turns out, so like we were working from home. I would get my work done. And I think we all kind of realized that when we were working from home, we could finish 8 hours of work in like four.
Yes.
And so I'd have all this time, and it was just like pouring out of me constantly. I was writing like 8 or 9 hours a day, this story. And I think it had a lot to do that Frankie, like the main character, and also the other characters in the book were all just kind of like subsets of my brain and personality a little bit. So it was almost like a diary that I was having of like, how would I respond in this situation? And it was weirdly cathartic considering I've never been in any of these fantastical situations, but it felt like a fantasy diary for a while for all the characters, actually, not just Frankie. And it I don't know, it kind of created this whole other aspect of my life that I didn't realize I loved until I just tried it. Like I had never written fiction before, and I've hopefully like one of these days I should take a workshop or something just to like get the foundations, because this was literally just me being like, I want this to happen next. I want this to happen next. And then editing it 200, 300 times until it started making sense, because I didn't have a timeline, I didn't have an outline, I was just going. And I was editing it. I drafted it, which I was the opposite as I am now. I drafted it in probably a month, and I edited it
Wow.
for about a year, just
Yeah.
because it was just a heaping pile of stream of consciousness. But it was good. It like, and I have not had a similar experience yet, just where something just totally pours out of you. But I think if that were to happen, that means I would have like very similar characters and similar settings and things, just because I was like, these are the trees I had in my backyard. This is a house
Mm,
that's similar to one that I lived in as a kid, things like that. And it just happened, and it felt very personal to me. And now it's more exploring things like other gender protagonists and other relationships, and maybe people who would make decisions that I would never think of making, and what are their motivations for doing that. And it takes a lot more investment than Peachy, which I love. Peachy, it has like this place in my heart that nothing will ever take, but it was easy because I was writing from a very personal perspective, I think, and now I'm really trying to get out
branch
there
out.
and do other
Yeah.
things. Yeah.
Yeah. I love that though. I love when I know whether a character is embedded in the author's personality
Mhm.
versus someone who's completely not. And I really think that's cool that you said like Frankie and all the other characters are kind of subsets of
Mhm.
your mind. And I love the term fantasy diary. That's a really cool way
Thank
to
you.
explain it.
And I
Yeah.
remember, like, I watched a video and I got really self-conscious because people were like, you should never like insert yourself into a character or whatever. And they brought up Stephanie Meyer as one of the people that did
Mm,
that. But I do think it's like it only really becomes an issue or a point of contention if you make that character like completely flawless. But if you give them flaws that either you have or you recognize in someone like you or then and just make them a real it makes them real rather than making them this like person on a pedestal that you also maybe it's the person you wish you were or something
mm,
like that. But if they're not flawed, then I could see why people would think like this is just like your own personal fantasy and you wrote it out, which actually I personally don't see much problem with that. If people enjoy the story and it's your own, I wish I met a vampire and he loved me more than anything in the world, and like that's fine. I think if people
right.
enjoy it, but I know people are like, this is clearly you and how you see yourself. As long as I guess like the author intent is messy for sure. I
Yeah.
but Frankie isn't 100% me. I don't have the same issues that she does, but I do think that our inner monologues are very similar. And that's where I was getting it. But I think I actually act a lot more like Ben, and I have hobbies similar
Mm,
to like Cleo. And so I just kind of like mash them together. But Frankie is a lot surlier and grumpier than me. And I think one of the reasons I did that is because I was afraid that people would see her as like the situation of like, oh, it's just you and you made her perfect. And I do not think
yeah.
Frankie is perfect at all, but that's why I think she's very special.
Yeah, I think that's easier though to do in those first couple of projects though, to self-insert whether subconsciously or
Yeah.
consciously, because like you said, you kind of get in this flow state. You're writing trees in your backyard,
Hmm.
buildings that you are reminding you of places you've lived before. And I think yeah, it can definitely come out a lot easier than
Yeah.
trying to embody worlds or people that you've never been in before.
Yeah, that's a real challenge. And I think a lot of people would say that it's like a shortcut, but I don't see anything wrong with that either. I definitely think it's a doorway into writing things. And if writing things
Mm,
sort of from your perspective or from your memories unlocks things, I also think it gives it a certain life and a certain heart because it's clearly very close to you or close to your memories, and it seems more real that way. And even if it is just kind of like your way of getting into writing to self-insert and to write about like maybe a town that you grew up in and just kind of change a couple of things, I think that's great. And then you can expand and you can grow. I don't see it as a shortcut. I see it as definitely just like a door to walk through. And I think it helps. And also, it's fun to remember those things and like put them into a story. Like every now and then I'll go to a movie and just remember something about when I was a kid and how, it reminded me of something. And I'm like, that would be a perfect,
mhm.
just weird little quirk to put in a story. Because
Yeah.
so many characters are so odd in ways that are hard to even consider. Because I feel like a lot of characters are pretty normal, other than being magical or super or, the chosen one. But real people have a lot of strangeness and a lot of quirks that you don't really think about until it's comes from you or your past or somebody a lot of the time.
Mhm.
And so I think it's wonderful. I think you should use your life as much as you want. Like if Stephanie Myers made a huge killing off inserting herself in this romance she wishes were real, cool. I love
Love
those
that.
books. Yeah. And that was definitely when I read them when I was 14, inserting the hell out of myself into that.
Yes. We talked a little bit about this when we first started, but obviously it feels like you've taken time to reflect on where you are, where you're from, and how that impacts your writing. And I pulled the line from your bio because I loved it that you said you were raised by a welder and a Jack Mormon in the small town of Wallsburg and then worked your way up to the grid city, Salt
Yeah.
Lake. So
Thank
beautiful
you.
sentence, but I would love to know how does place and Utah impact your writing?
Utah is a very is an odd place, I would say too. It's a state that gets made fun of a lot, which I'm sure being from Cleveland, yeah, you get a lot of those jokes you said yourself.
Yep.
We obviously have the LDS Church, which is our biggest, I don't know what the word is, but the recognition we get is from the LDS Church.
Mhm.
Everyone knows it and associates us with it. And I had a lot of family, like my mom is a Jack Mormon. She claims to be of the church, but drinks coffee and alcohol and swears and does all the
Mhm.
things that she does. Doesn't go to church, but my grandma like served missions. My great grandma served several missions, so it's just kind of like diluted as you go down. But um, that was always the first question I got is, oh, your book is from Utah. How have you integrated the church into your story? And a lot of them suggested either making them like evil witches and that the church is like a front for that, or making them good, or just making them like a constant focal point in the state. Because sometimes it does seem like that when you live here. But I really just wanted something to exist in Utah in entertainment that had nothing to do with the church. I just wanted it to be a normal state where, because there are kids and people who do not go to the church, who are not associated with
Yeah.
the LDS church and live their life. And like, I just barely watched an interview with Anna Kendrick, who I love, and she said that she would watch the Secret Lives of the
Yeah.
Mormon
Was that the
Housewives.
Caller
I remember
Daddy
it's called.
podcast?
What?
Was it the Caller Daddy podcast
Yes.
interview? I just
Yes.
watched that
Yes.
today.
And she watched the Mormon
Yeah.
Housewife show, and she's like, but I heard the bars they went to like didn't serve alcohol or serve something else. And so she's like, never mind, I don't want to live in Utah. And to be fair, we have bars. We have regular bars, we
Yeah.
have wonderful breweries, we have things you can do. We have, especially while I live in Salt Lake, which is a little different than rural Utah. But I grew up in rural Utah, and it's the church is just, it does have a lot of presence in things like our governments and our liquor laws and a lot of things like that. And it feels a little oppressive sometimes. And so I really just wanted something that had nothing to do with it. But that is always the question I get first is, how is the church in your story? And I love that we have a thing in Utah that has represents like Salt Lake City and some of the restaurants, and also like Paired has a lot of the national parks and it has a lot of our forests and creatures and just general family lifestyle of a Utahn, but not necessarily one that is defined by their faith. And I love that. But I grew up, yeah, in a super tiny town. My mom came from a very long Mormon background, and we were the only family that like didn't go to church, but we had great acreage, and there's always sagebrush and aspen trees, and it was actually wonderful regardless of whether people would ask you if you're LDS or not. It was just a wonder. It's Utah's a great place to be a kid. Everyone is super nice for the most part, and it's safer. And, we could go explore. And I remember like hearing the sounds in the yellow grass and thinking it was snakes constantly. And that kind of just landed in my story without thinking. Whenever you're walking between fields in Utah, you can see things moving around in the grass. And it came out of me without even thinking about it, because I've never lived anywhere else. And I've lived in the small parts of Utah and the biggest city in Utah. And I don't see myself ever leaving, even with things about it that I don't necessarily agree with or are not the biggest part of my life. I just love it here, and I really wanted something to represent my love of the state and not necessarily just everyone's idea of the state. But in the horror that I'm writing right now, I'm thinking of integrating it a little bit, just like the teeniest
Mm,
bit, because it is
just a
it is
little
I
bit.
understand it's interesting to people. And I just really watched Heretic, the movie about the two Mormon missionaries, which
Yeah.
was amazing. But I can understand the curiosity of people for sure, which is
Hmm.
why everyone wants to learn more about the polygamy and, the FLDS church and things like that. It's interesting. Moving forward, I could see myself integrating it a little bit, but I really, yeah, I like being a Utahn on just as that is.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of great things about here that I liked putting in there for sure. And hopefully more people will see that Utah, Salt Lakes especially, is like, it's a regular city and it's a great city. And it's not because people are always like, can you even buy coffee there? Like, can you go out on
Mm.
Sundays? Are places open on Sundays? And I'm like, it's pretty normal. There's some weirdness, but it is actually pretty normal.
I've only been to Utah a couple times for the national parks, but every time I go, I am obsessed with the state. And I've told my husband, I
Yay!
was like, if we move anywhere, it would be Salt Lake
That's
because
so
I
exciting.
love Utah. Yeah. And then I keep interviewing amazing Utah authors. I'm like, it's a sign.
Utah's pretty cool. The mountains are super gorgeous. It's just it's a wonderful place to be. And the city is like the perfect size. It's not too big, it's not too
Hmm.
small. And we live pretty centrally in the city, so we get to go to all the bars. Now we got a new hockey team, and we might be getting an MLB team, and
Fun.
we're kind of growing up a little bit. Kind of
Yeah.
making a
You're
big
like on
deal
your
in
way.
this city. People might take us a little cereal.
Yeah. I love that. Well, I pulled another line from your website because it was so great. And you said that you write about witches, hauntings, and dirtbags. And as someone who's also drawn to witches, hauntings, and dirtbags, I would love to know what draws you to these topics.
So yeah, I think, well, the dirt bags I think is actually the most important of all of those things. I all of my characters, I think they're more flawed than not all the time, but I also tend to fixate on their flaws more than not because I think that's relatable, first of all, but it's what makes them interesting. Like, I don't necessarily want to read about how selfless you are because who isn't? Like, I'd rather read about this horrible thing that you did that you've kept secret from everyone, or like even the characters that are the least likable in my stories are my favorite ones because they're the funnest ones to write. They stir up stuff the most. So I wrote one book that so right after Peachy and Paired, I wrote this horror story called Reap What You Sow. It's from a male perspective, which I'd never tried to write before. And I had purposefully tried to make him the so unlikable, like so unlikable, because you have to follow him regardless of whether you think he's a good person or not. You
Yeah.
have to follow him through his journey. And my agent really loved it. I loved it because it was just so nice to kind of beat down to like just survival primal brain of this man who is not trying to save anybody, who wasn't trying to help anybody or save the world. He was just trying to get out of a scary situation. And if other people got hurt, like that's not his problem. And I think like I'm not saying that like you or I would be in the situation, but I do think a lot of people would go into survival mode and just
Yeah.
like leave their friends behind and try to get to safety, whether they would admit it or not. And so I think it's just like writing about dirtbags is funny a lot of the time too because they have all these flaws that they usually wear on their sleeve and you just have to kind of deal with, and they don't care whether you like them for the most part, which I also like. It just has a it's there's a real genuineness if you don't care and just present your flaws to your friends, to your strangers, whatever. But this guy was bad through and through, and but as much as we liked it, we did get a lot of criticism saying he's too unlikable, no one's going to root for
Mm.
him. And fair, very fair. However, we've gotten a lot of feedback since. This was a couple years ago when I wrote this book, and it kind of got shelved, and we would go back to it at another time. And but now people are like this. The horror is kind of having its moment, and
Hmm.
horror is also getting to the point where it's not the same story that we've been getting, which is the final girl who is the smart one or the virginal one or what have you, and so therefore she's the most worthy of survival. But back then, I kind of wanted to flip that on its head and be like, what if the final girl is the least worthy of survival? But at the same time, they're probably the most likely because they're not trying to help anybody. They're not trying to save anybody.
Mm.
So I wrote from that and I really liked that idea, but they said that you need someone to root for. But now I think that is kind of changing and we're getting more complex, fuller characters that don't have to be one way in which if they're going to make it all the way to the end, they need to be a good person. And
Hmm.
I disagree. And I think that's a fun story. And while obviously there are heroes in horror, there's always monsters, and sometimes the whole book is monsters. And I'm not saying that's not an interesting story, and maybe we need to give those stories a little more time. But
Yeah.
I love, yeah. If you're not like as far as the witches and the hauntings, I love a monster, I love a slasher, I love a survival story. And so it's just like if you're not fighting for your life or you're not fighting your loved ones or if you're not fighting your own insanity, like what is the point? What are we doing
What are we
here?
even reading right now?
Yes. I just have to. It just comes like I will start writing something. I'm like, well, that got very violent very fast, and it's just I can't help it. I just love it.
That's really interesting too. We talked about publishing trends that now editors are like, wait, actually, we could work with this.
Hmm.
And I wonder if it is the horror or if people are getting more acceptable of unlikable characters, maybe a combination of both.
I think TV is also helping us do that. We're getting a
Mm,
lot of TV with complex characters that make bad
true.
choices or do unlikable things. And so just the more we kind of get away from the typical archetype of what a main character is supposed to be, I think it's expanding. But it's also I know hard for publishing TV movies to take a risk on things they're not sure about.
Yeah.
So like I've also seen like a Seth Rogen interview where he said that comedies aren't really happening anymore because no production company wants to buy a movie that doesn't already have an IP or some sort of universe
Mm,
already attached to it because it's a risk. And so when you're writing a book like that where they're like this is a risk, there's not a lot of books out there like this, and when they are it gets a lot of criticism. So I do get it. I do get that as a risk. But I also think that every now and then someone takes a chance and
yeah.
that becomes a little bit of a trend. So, yeah.
Who knows? We'll see. And are you still currently, like, you're currently an archivist? I know you talked about your job beforehand with like the local newspaper. Are you an
Yeah, I'm
archivist
an
now?
archivist at a PBS, and
Fun.
which is owned by the University of Utah. And I haven't told my boss yet because it literally happened today. So, but I just got a librarian position at the U's library at the Marriott Library on the University of Utah campus, and I'm on the
Very
tenure track,
fun.
so I get tenure, and I'm a full-fledged librarian. I got my my master's of library science degree 7 years ago, and I've been archiving in AV materials ever since. But now, after 7 years, I will finally become a librarian, and I will be
That's
on the
so
tenure track.
fun.
Yes, and I will be doing some research as far as like digital trends and I'm very, very excited. And luckily, both the archivist job and this new job are hybrid jobs. So when I work from home, it's the same as it was in the pandemic. I can usually bust it out 3, 4 hours, and then I have a lot of time to work on books and things like that. But for this last 6 months, yeah, I had no inspiration. I was dealing with some stuff at home. And so I was mostly focused on my physical, mental, emotional health for a while. And it's
Hmm.
very, very hard to use your brain in those situations. So I would be scrolling a lot on my phone, and it was horrible. It would just make me very
Yeah.
sad. It wasn't helping, but at the same time, it was a way to just kill my brain. So I would just
Hmm.
have the same show I've watched 100 times on in the background, and I would scroll my phone, and I did that for months. I would open a doc and try to write something, and I just like could not use my brain. I didn't want to, so I just shut down again. And I would say just like a month ago, I started writing, and all this inspiration, all these new ideas are just like coming out of me, and it's been wonderful. But I think one of the other hard things about being a writer is people are constantly expected to keep pumping out words all the
Yeah.
time. And a lot of my friends do that. They're like 3, 4 books a year, and they've never had a lot of issue. But you have these expectations of doing that, and the more you put pressure on yourself to get done faster, the more you'll hate writing, and it's not going to be fun
Yeah.
anymore. And I went through a period of like maybe a year where it wasn't fun. I was trying to meet a deadline, and I was really stressed because the book wasn't good enough in my opinion, and it was like so overdue that I would just stare at it and just like sob. I'm like, this is
Yeah.
terrible, it's not done, I can't think of a way to make it better. And I also was so obsessed with getting it done that I couldn't take a step back and say like, let's
Hmm.
take 2 weeks. Like I wouldn't allow myself to do that, so I just kept seeing the same pages over and over again, hating them more every time, and still telling myself like, this is your dream, and it is my dream. But it takes a lot of self-awareness of saying, you're not in a good place to write this, you're not having fun, we need to take a
Yeah.
hiatus. Yeah, because
Yeah.
writing's
We
supposed to
need
be
to
fun.
take a
Yeah.
little time. It is. It is. That's very
Yes,
true. So rest is important.
it is. I would
Rest.
say that
Yes.
for sure, because I was
Yes.
pushing myself really, really hard. After Peachy and Paired, I was so desperate to get an agent that I like wasn't doing anything other than writing. I wrote a story and I submitted it to several agents, and it was more promising than Peachy, but one of the agents said like, this isn't the story for me, but I do love your writing, like send me your next one. And because she said that, I like basically wrote an entire other book just for her, because she gave me this like, maybe it wasn't even a promise, it was like,
Right.
oh, let's look at it a little later. And I wrote an entire book and sent to her, and she liked that one. That was the one with the male protagonist that was unlikable, and
Hmm.
so it took me on as an agent. But he was too unlikable, she said. And because again, I was just so desperate for this book deal, for this success, to be an author, like all of, because it's I kind of talked about this before on my own social media, but it's kind of frowned upon by the industry to post about things that aren't seen as like widely successful. So like I had a book get shelved. It did not get purchased on submission. And no one else talks about that, because if you post about your non-successes, it's seen as, okay, so you're not constantly winning. That's a risk, basically. But it happens to every author in the industry. It's very, very common, but we don't talk about it because we don't want to be seen as someone who's not viable in the industry. And so you're just constantly surrounded by your fellow authors who are only posting about their deals and their successes and their contracts. And it just feels like you're getting left behind a lot of the time. And so I was so desperate to get a book deal. I wrote another book incredibly quickly, and that was the one where I was just hating it. I was staring at it, I was crying. But I just wanted to, because I told myself, if you just get a book deal, then you can relax, and
Hmm.
you kind of got your foot in the door, and you can start having fun again. But you just have to get this deal from like a big five publishing house, and then everything's gonna be okay. And I didn't see myself as being like worthy until I did that, because all of my
Mhm.
friends were doing that. Like we did our small press together. I had a lot of friends that were in the same publishing house as me. And then so many of them got agents. And then I was desperate to get an agent to like keep up with them. And then so many of those got big book deals. And then I was so desperate to just be on the same playing field that I really lost why I was doing it in the first place.
Yeah.
So now with this hiatus, I'm back better than ever. It's going to be amazing.
Yes.
And everyone always tells you not to compare yourself to other people in the industry, but I really think it's impossible. Like you shouldn't, but you're going to. And it's going to be hard.
Yeah, that is an interesting point too. I don't think a lot of people talk about that nuance of we are told to get a writing community, to find people who write, but it can be really difficult when you have now all these amazing writer friends. You love them to bits, you're
Hmm.
supporting each other, but then maybe, okay, now one gets an agent, two gets an agent, three gets
Yeah.
an agent. Now there's one book deal, two book deal, three book deal. And if you aren't the person who, like you said, like is on par with everyone, it can start to feel like panic inducing, even though you're like, I love my friends, I support my friends.
Yes.
But yeah, it can feel scary because this world of publishing, everything does take time and it is about your accolades at the end of the day.
Yeah.
That's like what we're talking about. So it can feel
Exactly.
scary.
That's a very that's so well put because it's like you feel guilty for being jealous of them because everyone's just
Mhm.
like you should only be happy for them. And you are happy for them, but of course you're going to be jealous of them. They did the thing that you're trying to do, like they made it. And you love them and you're so happy for them, but you also of course you want to make it too. And the more of your
Mhm.
friends that are doing it, you're just like, am I not as good as them? Is there something wrong with my writing? Should I change something? And it's just it's this is an industry in which you're forced to compete against each other a lot of the time because there's only
Yeah.
so many books, there's only so many agents taking on your genre, things like that. But it's also an industry in which we're constantly supporting one another. So it's like so many writers are so wonderful and so helpful to each other, and I have the best writing friends in the whole world who would do anything to help me if I'm struggling. But it's just this dichotomy of every time they get a success, you're so proud of them and you're so disappointed in yourself in the exact same moment for not doing
Mm.
exactly what they just did. And I think that's just a reality. It's
Yeah.
not something you should feel bad about. It's just something you saying like I am jealous of that and that's okay. But I'm also very proud of them and I know that they deserved this. It's just like you
Yeah.
should acknowledge both things. And I also think that it should be more widely accepted to say I had a book die in submission, or I've queried 50 agents and I don't have an agent, or a book deal fell off, things like that. Or I can't finish this book just because I have writing blocks, some writer's blocks, I'm gonna start over. And those are all great and they're not bad, but it's seen as bad because it's like less marketable, and it's unfortunate. It's really unfortunate.
Yeah.
I think that causes a lot of
And
the guilt over jealousy because you're not talking about it.
right, like if people aren't talking about it a ton either, and if you're a newer writer, let's say, maybe, something died on sub, but you don't see anyone talking about things dying on sub, it can make it
Mhm.
feel like you're the only author ever to have something die on sub, or
Yes.
you're the only author ever to be like, actually, I need to pause this project because my heart's not in it. I got to do
Hmm.
something else. Because, yeah, you're right. We don't talk about our failures enough.
Right.
And art is a lot of failure.
A lot of that, and it's just a lot of things don't work. People don't like it. That doesn't mean it's not other people wouldn't like it, or it doesn't mean it's not good. Like the market is super difficult, but it's also,
Mhm.
I think a lot of people when they do have books or something die on submission, it's very common to say like they just blame the whole industry. Traditional publishing's hard, everything sucks. And I do that. Traditional publishing is totally hard, but I just think if more people were talking about things that didn't work out, it would be less villainizing of traditional publishing and more just like 50% of books don't sell their first round. You know what I mean? Like it would just be
Right.
more data based, less personal, and
Mhm.
then we could all kind of learn from each other and each other's mistakes, which would be nice, but you have to talk about them first to be able to learn from each other.
Yeah. Yeah, what do you like, what would be your major advice then for someone who might be going through these queried trenches and, wanting an agent, wanting that deal?
I think just what I learned from it is that, and I think it's kind of cliche, but from what I've learned, it's the most true is that it doesn't have to, even if it doesn't happen right now, That doesn't mean you're bad at it. It doesn't mean you should stop doing it. It doesn't mean you should hate your friends or hate the industry and leave. It's like when I queried Peachy, I queried, I think, 70 agents, and all of them said no. And then I did a pitch event, and a small press liked it, 3-book deal. But then I queried agents with another book, and everyone said no. And I was just so desperate to have things happen right now that I
Mhm.
ruined writing as a whole for me for a while. And it's just kind of take a little page from the traditional publishing and take your time. And if you need a day, take a day. And if you also are feeling bad, that's okay. You're not alone. Know that you're never ever alone. You're not the only person who had a book die on sub. You're not the only person who's questioning whether it's good or not. And when you get notes on your doc from an editor or from a beta reader or whatever, and they're saying like you should change this, or I don't like this, or this is awkward, that doesn't mean that you're bad. You should just take it in stride. And I know it's so hard, but you just have to be patient. You have to have faith in yourself, and that's probably the hardest part, is just believing that even if it takes 10 years, you're still doing something you love. So do it the right way and don't ruin it for yourself. Just do it because you love it, and things will fall into place naturally, because if you love it, it shows in the pages. But if you hate it,
Yeah.
that shows too.
It does. No, that's really true. And I follow Lake Country Press is actually how I found you and your book Peachy. And I really like all the books that they're putting out. How was working with Lake Country Press? I don't know if small presses are talked about enough as well as like an option in publishing.
It was wonderful, especially because unlike if I was like with a big publishing company, it was very personable. I got emails back within seconds. I got a lot of reassurance. I got a lot of instruction. And it was a smaller group when I got signed. So it was maybe like 10 of us. We all got incredibly close. We talked all the time. But it was kind of scary because a lot of other small presses were kind of getting spotlit as being
Mm,
toxic or dangerous at the time, and exploiting their authors. And so it was kind of at a time when I was like, are small presses even like a legitimate option? Are people just kind of using it as a means of taking advantage of authors? And that was not the case with the country press. It was very like the head Brittany is very
mhm.
hands-on, and she's incredibly helpful, and it's also an opportunity in which you don't have to do a lot of, because in big publishing you have to make a lot of changes a lot. So you have to kind of, you'll get your choices obviously, and they'll never make you do anything that you're super uncomfortable with. But with a small press, it's like if this is the way you want the story to go, then that's the way that it's going to go, unlike if you're working with a bigger place a lot of the time. So it was like you got to make it your own much more, and you got
Yeah.
to handle your baby in a way that you couldn't if you were at a big place. So it was like a really great way to get my trilogy out there, because I don't think it would have gotten out there. It wasn't marketable. Big publishers didn't want it, agents didn't want it because it wasn't trending. So this is a way to get a book that I truly loved out into readers' hands, even if it wasn't like going to be this huge market like Penguin Random House book. That would have never happened. So it's like this is was so wonderful, and that I got to have, and not only just one book, but three books is a lot of faith in me, a lot of trust in me, and it was an honor, honestly. And they were able to do things that I would never have expected. I got my books in Barnes and Nobles across the country, and they became
Mhm.
bestsellers. And they also were just like very supportive and kind. And so when I told her like I need to take some time off, she said, take all the time that you need, no rush. And again, if I were working at a bigger publishing house, that probably wouldn't have happened either.
Right.
Yeah, so it was
Yeah.
great. And now I kind of am expecting to get into like a bigger pond per se, hopefully. That's the dream for me, is I want to be a
Mhm.
trad unpublished author eventually. So it's like you kind of accept that, even though it's a different type of publishing. It's very personal, but it was a great way to be introduced to the industry.
So with Peachy, Paired, and Buried, it's a trilogy. Did you always know it was going to be a series then?
I did know it was always going to be a trilogy, but that was kind of based on. So while I was in school taking an English class, I had a teacher, and he was quoting an author. So I don't even remember who the author was, but he said, if you want, if you're looking through a bookstore and you're not finding the book that you want, just write it yourself. And all the books that we had talked about that I loved, that were in the genre I loved, were trilogies, if not longer, 6 books, 7 books. So I knew there had to be multiple um, instantiations of it. Otherwise, it wouldn't be what I loved. I knew I had to have some sort of cliffhanger, and it had to have continuation, and I had to
Mm.
have growth. Because every single book that was my favorite was a part of a series. But now I do wish I did more of a duology instead. It's very tough to continue to raise the stakes again, especially when I consider Peachy a pretty high stakes, at least at the end book, and then the next book
Yeah.
you raise the stakes even more, and then you need to do it again a third time, especially in this like your final act, the final showdown, so it has to be more intense really than the first two. And it also has to have like a continuation of a magical system, and like previous characters will need to return, and we need to close all the doors that I opened in the first two books, and that's gonna be a challenge. Yes, but it was like I was like the heyday of books for me were paranormal multiple book series, and that's what I want to write. And so I always knew, but I'm not a plotter, I'm a pantser.
Yeah.
Pantser. I don't know like the lingo as well, honestly. But so I just every book that I've written, I don't know how it's gonna end. I usually know like three scenes that I've just daydreamed about over and over again, and I don't know how they're gonna connect. And I just have to figure it out.
Yeah.
And so that's where I'm at with Buried, is that every book I've written, I didn't know where they were gonna go, or what they were gonna do, or how I was gonna raise the stakes until they just were raised. And so I'm kind of hopefully can raise them enough and then finish it in a clean way, because I really need to probably start outlining and plotting, or I will
Yeah.
dig myself in these holes. Unless I guess I just keep writing standalones. It's not as hard if you just write a standalone. And that's probably why I shifted. It's just because it's
Yeah.
so much easier.
I have a couple friends who completely pants their stories, and I'm almost like an over planner where like it can overdo it. So I'd also love to find like a happy medium. So I love that you know, have the
Yeah,
pantsing
it's
gene.
all vibes. It's not yeah, it's not like people are always like, "How's it going? How long do you think until you finish?" I'm like, "I don't even know how long it's gonna be. I just write till it's done." Yeah, it's like I have no plan.
No idea.
That's how I live my life.
So with the scenes then, were there specific scenes with Peachy, even though it started off as this dystopian-esque book and kind
Hmm.
of morphed into what it is now?
Yeah. So I always had the scene where Frankie's walking around town, that first chapter, drunk. That was always in my head. And that's just like it painted her as the dirtbag she was, and it really gave people a taste of like how she was going to be for the rest of the series, and I loved that. So I would always think about that one. But then Payman, depending on where you live, the demon, I thought about them all the time. And they were kind of like clownish to me in my head, but I love, and I kind of, it was like a Freddy Krueger meets the Insidious demon meets Pennywise the clown from It, and they were always some of my favorites. And those scenes were always incredibly powerful to me because they scared me. And I do love a villain that plays with its food and likes to be funny
Yeah.
and make these jokes. And so I always really liked them as a character, and those scenes were really, really actually. And then this, so there's sort of probably four. The scene with Patrick when he shifts into a
Mhm.
were and destroys his whole glass house. I think that one was fun, and that one was always there. And then just Ben in general. I would always think about Ben. I was a little in love with him going through this, and so I was always just waiting for him to come back on page. So I would daydream about him in general all the time. Like I can't wait till he's
So this
here.
was your Stephanie Meyer
Yeah,
insert.
basically, yeah, yeah. In a way, yeah.
Yeah, in a way.
But I do think that, everyone in these books, everyone, especially in paired, makes some very big, big, big mistakes.
Mhm.
And they have to pay for them. Unlike, and their mistakes are not out of selflessness or what have you, or trying to do something the right thing, even though it hurts. They are all acting selfishly or just without thinking. And now this whole butterfly effect has happened that hurts everybody they care about, basically. And so, and that's kind of, I like that about them, in that it's not just one person that's always kind of hurting another person and they just end up it's everyone is acting in a way that I wouldn't necessarily approve of, but they're very human in a way. They're very human in this fantasy series, and they're constantly going to be doing the wrong things, but it's also a story about family, and hopefully
Yeah.
eventually they understand that they need to forgive each other and forgive themselves and just continually keep growing as this group rather than break apart because they messed up or what have you. I'd rather it be a family, and families mess up and you just got to keep coming back to the living room and keep chatting, I guess. And that's kind of where I'm
Yeah.
at right now, is I'm hoping to create a really strong dynamic between the characters in that they can hurt each other, but they're going to be back.
Yeah, which is true. And I do like the exploration of characters who, like you said, mess up badly. And there is a fascination for it. I think a lot of people gravitate or try to write those morally gray characters, but I think there is something about a character who like actually messes up, like
Yeah.
completely acts selfishly and messes up and has to pay for it. Doesn't
I
happen that
think it's
often.
I think especially with being selfish, like so many main characters are like if they are morally gray, they're usually doing something reprehensible, but for the person they care about. Like maybe they kill a
Right.
person in a book, but it's for like their little brother or something, or maybe they're hot-headed and is like their flaw, but it's because like
Hmm.
they're on the streets or something and they had to be tough growing up. So it like I find that a lot of like morally gray characters are more having to do with things like violence and murder, and that
Yeah.
makes them morally gray. But morally gray I also think has to do with emotional damage to people you care about, and then having to grow from that. And it's not just always, this person was stabbed or this person was eaten by a dragon or whatever. It's like this person that we have this strong emotional bond hurt me and I hurt them,
Hmm.
and those were choices that we made, and I think that makes it really realistic, this fantasy world. But I also know and totally understand people don't like to read about those things. They want to escape from those situations because they want pain and morally gray to be more about like war and what you would do in
Mm.
war or a battle or what you would do with a prisoner or something, a situation that you never find yourself in, and that's why it's escapism. But I kind of feel like there should be a little bit more, because every time I see people who don't like reading, like and trigger warnings are 100%, I totally agree, and you
Right.
don't have to read anything you don't want to, but most people are having a lot of things to do with more emotional damage when it comes to morally
Mm.
gray, like infidelity type situations or abandonment. But it morally gray, I think there's a lot more to it, because a lot of morally gray
Mm.
characters aren't as morally gray as I think people say that they are. Like they might kill people,
I
but who doesn't?
agree.
Yeah.
I know. I feel like it has become one of those, I don't even know what to say. It's just become like a flashy word in
Hmm.
publishing. People use it in a lot of like trope lists and charts.
Yes.
And I agree. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Like the morally gray characters they do morally gray acts, but it is usually in the service of someone else, whether it's
Hmm.
like their love, their sibling,
Right.
their city, they're protecting. I
Right.
do feel like they're still like
Or
doing a
maybe they like
lot for
rob
others.
people, which kind of feels a
Right.
little victimless because you don't know these people that are getting robbed or how their lives are affected. It's
And they
much
could be Robin
harder.
Hood.
Exactly. It's much harder to see your favorite characters on page hurt your
Mm,
other favorite characters. And
yeah.
so it's like it's just you're so used to seeing victimless crime in morally gray characters. And I totally get if people don't want to read about this, but I do like reading about these situations because I just think it adds a complexity to
Yeah.
them. And I don't necessarily think all characters need to be like, I love them, they're the best character, like they can do no wrong in my book. I'm like, they can and they should, and you should be able to
Hmm.
see them as whole characters that do really heartbreaking things and really wonderful things too. And
Yeah.
I'm also not encourage it's like I'm like so afraid, I guess, of stepping on my own toes, but like I'm not
Yeah.
encouraging people to hurt each other and saying I like that.
Right.
I'm just I'm saying like when I'm reading a book, I like to have a very fleshed out character that is super capable, and every character I write is capable of anything at any time if they're put in the right
Hmm.
circumstance.
But I think that's unfortunately life. Like that is more realistic. Like you said, like families hurt each other. And it's
Mhm.
usually like the people that are closest to us will end up hurting us, whether
Mhm.
it's intentional or not.
Right.
And I think that that does reflect real life. This is like a little left field, but I'm obsessed with reality TV. And I feel like I'm obsessed always because I treat it like a sociology experiment. I'm constantly like someone does something reprehensible on national television and everyone is instantly like, we hate this person. They're the
Yes.
worst person in the world. And I'm like, well, hold on. Let's take a step back. Like, I think they did X because of all these reasons. Like, I always try to like find
Right.
that new one. And I think that's why I love reality TV. So I
Right.
feel you. I want that in my books too. Like, I want to root for the good parts of the characters and allow them to have the bad, I guess.
Yes. Yes, 100%. And even like in reality TV, I would say like even if they're saying like this character is the worst, I hate them, how could they say this? I find that one of the reasons reality TV is great is actually because everyone on that show has a moment where you're like, "Oh my God, I can't believe they did that." Like they are all kind of showing their ass a little bit.
Mhm.
And that's why we love to watch it. Like you have
Yeah.
to like show that human side in which you're going to mess up and people are going to get mad, and that's what makes them real and very watchable, and that's how what I like about characters too, is that it's not just, "Oh, like, he killed a couple generals, he's morally gray." No,
Right.
no, no. I
No,
need
no,
I
no.
need a little more. Yeah, I need a little more.
So, how was character creation for you then? Like, pantsing this story, did you know all the characters or were they just kind of like appearing as you were writing?
They were hmm. So, that's a good question. I feel like I knew of them, but they did shift and change as I was writing it, because I even when I would like, because I am a pantser, but I would write like in my notes app, like Frankie, surly, drunk, like depressed, dead grandma.
Yeah.
And then Ben, I would be like artistic, playful, but that doesn't really give you the things that they're gonna say, or like the things that they like, or the things they do with their hands, or like their nervous ticks and things like that. So they definitely became more than they were, because it's really hard to define a character with like three adjectives and then say
Hmm.
like that's a full fleshed out character. But that's how I was creating them, was and I also did this thing, I don't remember what it's called. I want to say it's like art creator or something, but I made the faces of all of them too,
Yeah, yeah.
and without even trying. So like a lot of their expressions would be different just by like AIing two faces together, but some of them would look angry and some would look really happy, and that actually just like seeing like a natural tilt to their mouth in a way, and like
Mm.
seeing them actually helped push things along, because I could it's once you could see them in that way, like it just seems like Cleo naturally seemed very haughty and superior, because her portrait that I made, I was like very straight, long neck and shoulders, and very proud and very
Mm.
beautiful. And so like these things came out after I saw her, and then because like I remember the first scene I wrote with Cleo, she was very bubbly and playful, and that's actually how I was going to have her. But then the more I wrote and the more after I made this picture, I was like, that's not who she is at all. It's an act, and I changed it. And so I think that's one of the reasons I'm a pantser, is because a lot of the times what's in my head never feels natural
Mm.
on the scene. So they always change a little bit. But Frankie was, yeah, she was totally different, and I just kept changing like things the way she looked and the way she acted, and the more I changed, the more she became like this real person that I could envision. But she was like could not have been more different than I when I originally started writing, and it was just like, that doesn't feel right. This doesn't feel right, and I don't know. It's weird, because it's almost like she existed before I wrote her on the page, because I just kept getting
Yeah.
the details wrong, and I was like, nope, 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 nope. There's like, there she is. We
There
got her.
she
Yeah,
is.
yeah.
Do you feel like that was the same then with the magical aspect of Peachy? Since you do have like the fantasy elements, like were you pantsing those and changing them, or was that solidified?
That I wasn't so hmm. It was tough. I knew that there was going to be some sort of sacrificial element, because I liked the
Hmm.
witches to be a little like not Harry Potter. Like there has to be some sort of
Yeah.
cost. You can't just do it. That doesn't seem in balance with the world, in my opinion. So I knew there had to be some sort of cost. And I liked that the scary version of witches would have to like kill a fawn or use a dead man's toe or something
Yeah.
to make magic, because otherwise I think everyone would be a witch if you didn't have to do like some immoral act. And that's why witches were bad, is because they were willing to do these immoral acts for power. And so I was kind of leaning like not necessarily immoral, but we'll go back to like morally gray, doing things you probably don't want to do in a situation in which you have to, but are not like I got a lot of emails about the killing of animals at the end,
Yeah.
which I do get. But I was like, that's also like, in my opinion, what witchcraft would naturally be is doing
Yeah.
like something that just breaks your heart, but now you have this ability that you didn't have before. But so when I was trying to figure out how to do that, I obviously didn't want them like killing animals repeatedly on page.
Yeah.
But even what I did do was kind of controversial with my publisher in that they had to like hurt themselves in some way and cause and use the pain to create magic, just because she was like, you have a lot of depictions of self-harm, which I get. It's just like it's it's a very gray area when you have magical elements mixing with things that could be triggering to people, sort of, because
Hmm.
obviously self-harm is generally done in a different fashion than if you're like cutting your arm and then trying to like make water fill a glass or something like that. That's
Yeah.
very different, but it's still, we had to handle it with a bit of delicacy and not be too graphic and not put too much on page, and that's fair. But I just knew that I didn't want it to be easy, because
Hmm.
every time I see, and I love, don't get me wrong, I love a book, plenty of books in which you can just kind of learn magic and then you are a magical being. But I was like, well, then let's just do that. Like, everyone, I would do that.
Yeah.
Everyone would do that. I think, like, the reason I think these stories are so enticing is because these people are different, and I didn't want just a witch that you're born magic and then you get to do whatever you want. So it was just way too easy. And so, like, if you're going to have a werewolf, it's got to be painful and it's got to be hard, and
Hmm.
it's got to ruin your life a little bit. And if you're going to be a witch, it's got to interrupt everything, and you got to be willing to make a lot of sacrifices for this magic. And that's more like, I wanted it to be more like that, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I find that really fascinating, and that like lends with, what we talked about earlier with like the body horror and the horror element. But I do like the evenness that your magic system has, that you have to have something happen to you in order to make something happen, which
Yeah.
is very interesting.
It's also, I didn't realize how hard it was, like, creating a magical system. So I also kind of understood why people would write it as you're born magical, you could do magical things. That's great, because coming up with like a balance and actually a logic to magic
Yeah.
is very almost contradictory. That's tough. And so I was trying to make the as much sense as I could for something that didn't exist, and it's a challenge. And so now with horror, you don't like, it's good. I like horror because you can have these otherworldly entities, but they don't necessarily need to have like, oh, he can go through doors because of this and the science and this. It's just like, he's a monster, he's a ghost, and that's what they
Right.
do, and that's kind of nice. You can focus more on like creating dread and creating atmosphere and creating connections between your characters, rather than thinking of how these things work and why people would believe that it works.
Hmm.
And in fantasy, that's definitely the biggest challenge.
Yeah. So with editing, how did you edit this book? It took you a year, you said, to edit.
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
did you do it in stages where it's like, okay, now we're going to look at the magic system. Now we're going to look at the characters.
I would just do it a page at a time, and if it felt wrong, I would
Yeah.
change it. And that also led to
I'm
a
so
lot of
impressed.
inconsistencies. Yeah, because then I'd be in the back being like, this feels wrong, but it's different in the front, because now I've been editing this version of the draft for a week. And like 5 days ago, I forgot that I changed something in the beginning, and then it's
Mm,
at the end, it felt wrong or whatever, and I have to go back and do it again. And it was very, very difficult to just kind of remember, but I was obsessively writing at the time. So my brain was constantly on the dock. I was jumping around constantly, being like, I would just search for words in Microsoft, be like, find werewolf, and then I would like locate everywhere and try to make sure that everything just lined up as it was going. But it was chaos. It was absolute chaos. I also didn't have Grammarly or anything at the time, so there were so many weird
yeah.
typos. So like, and I would just think like, if there's not a red squiggly line, it's fine, it's done. And yeah, I think I sent my family like 30 versions of the book at least, but there were at least 60 in my computer of just me. And so I read the book at least 60 times, but probably more, from front to back,
Wow.
and to change little. And I would obsessively change, like I would say like, this word isn't conveying what I want it to, and I would just look at synonyms for an hour and try to find
Yeah.
like the word that had the vibe. Now it's a little less of the obsession for sure, but at the same time I have not edited a book in like 8 months. So maybe that's not
Yeah.
true. Maybe we'll find out. I am currently writing a book about a woman at the bottom of the sea whose own circulatory system is trying to flee her body to join the squids outside. And I do love that
I'm
because
obsessed
that
with
doesn't
that.
necessarily I don't it's a very weird story as to how this kind of came about into fruition. But I love it because it's super weird, but I don't need to explain it as far as because I'm not writing a sequel, so it doesn't need to continue. It can just be
Hmm.
like, but B, I don't need to say like, oh, this is scientifically why this might happen, and magically this is why it might happen, and here's the lore, and here's the history, and it's just like this is a scary, weird thing, and a lot of horror movies are just basically like, what if this horrifying thing happened and you don't know why, and that kind
Yeah.
of adds to the scare factor, and you could just have fun with it and be weird and be gross. And horror is really like I think the most freeing genre you can write in. You can upset people and you can gross people out and you can scare them and you also don't need to tell them why. And it's
Yeah.
perfect. You can just do whatever. Yeah, it's the most freeing genre, 100%. You just have to have like if you have to have some sort of like night terrors or nightmares and it's easy as pie.
Yeah. In an interview that I read that you did with Knee Brace Press, you state that the supernatural elements in the story force Frankie to face the things that have happened to her and deal with them, which we kind of talked about. How specifically, like in Peachy, does the supernatural elements kind of like point the mirror back at Frankie?
That's a really good question. I think that Frankie, especially in the first one, doesn't really think of herself as a good person or a bad person because A, she doesn't crave power at all.
Hmm.
And she likes to be alone to such an extent that she'd never really see herself as hurting somebody. And when she does things like steal, it's a victimless crime because nobody knows that she does it. She doesn't steal from people personally. And so she just sees herself as kind of middle ground. And even then, not even middle ground, she doesn't really consider her as far as like what side of the road she's on. She doesn't really even think about it because it doesn't
Hmm.
bother her. And then as she continues to get power, she has to start making some decisions. And I think it does reveal a part of herself because she's never had any sort of power or kind of control and she's never wanted it either. And then when she's given it, she kind of can turn into a different person sometimes and do things that maybe when she was just being depressed at home and laying around, she wouldn't have never done. That doesn't mean that those desires weren't there in her all along. And it also, if she has to face her fears, obviously, and this is kind of giving her a metaphorical way to do that because she's very traumatized from things that happened in her past and her family. And this is giving her a real life monster she can fight rather than like a memory or
Hmm.
an emotion she has. Like throughout the entire book, she is constantly fighting the fact that she is angry at her mom and that she is a bad person because she's angry at her mom for leaving her. And not, so she's constantly battling with who she is, if she's a bad person, if she's a good person. And by defeating a demon, that can kind of be like, okay, that was a good thing. So you can't be all bad. These are just feelings you have. You did something good. But then in the sequel, it becomes much less black and white, the things that she does and all the characters do. And that's also a book with all of their powers are heightening. So I think you have to kind of think of a person in which if they are feeling hurt or if they are finally giving something that they had never been given in their entire life, how it would change them. And also, and even if it's in a bad way, to have a little empathy for that and to be a little forgiving because if you were put in these situations and you were never ever given the chance to do them and you never even realized you wanted to do something like that, but then you finally can, you have the power and the ability to do so. I mean, I don't necessarily think that that's good, but it's not bad either. It's understandable. And so I think
Yeah.
she's constantly fighting her own fears and using her power, but it makes her feel like she finally has control over something, I think, in her life. And it alters her in a way that she was never expecting because she never expected herself to leave her room or to do it. And so she just saw herself as a lazy, kind of useless person who just wanted to be left alone and watch TV. And when she's put in a position of power, she realizes how much she wants it and what she's doing and what she'll do to keep it.
Hmm.
And it's not just necessarily like I'm going to hurt somebody. It's also I'm going to hurt somebody I truly care about maybe. And
Yeah.
you have to make these choices of things I've selfishly desired for a long time. and the feelings of people I care about. And I don't think it's as easy as a decision sometimes. It just depends on the circumstances you're in. And if you've never imagined yourself in that circumstance, or I've never been put in that circumstance, you really don't know what you're going to do until you do it. And I didn't know what Frankie was going to do until I was writing the scene. And then I was like, this feels like what she would do. This is natural for Frankie. Yes. And it just happened. And I do think that we got a new layer to every single character because they realized the things they were willing to do, or the people maybe they were willing to hurt one person they cared about in order to get another person they cared about. Like it's very tough. It's not just an easy choice a lot of the time that they're making. And it's hard to write, but it's also really fun to write. I really like the complex relationships. And yeah, Frankie is battling with herself through all of these
Mm,
books, and she's also given literal things to battle the whole time. And then we're also given, like, now I want to give her realistic reactions. Like, she's going to get some PTSD, obviously, and she's going to get
yeah.
depressed, or she's going to get anxiety, she's going to get nightmares, and she's going to have to deal with the ramifications of the danger she's in physically, and not use that as an excuse to not deal with the emotional ramifications as well. So it's been complicated. This is making me want to write the third one, actually.
Love
To get
that.
back to it, yes. Hopefully it'll be done in 2025.
Hmm.
It's just like finding the motivations is always
Yeah.
an interesting part of a character.
I was reading the reviews of Peachy, and there are a lot of reviews saying how amazing and witty the dialogue is, which I agree. And I marked it down because I struggle with dialogue so much. And I know I've talked to some of my viewers on the channel about this as well with dialogue. So, why do you think you write dialogue so well? Is there a secret that you have, or a way that you kind of get into the character's head to make like characters like Frankie and Ben just jump off the page?
That's really nice of you and the reviewers to say. The dialogue, I would say, actually, and I don't know if this is like really good advice, because I am a huge fan of TV and movies. Huge. It's always on for me. And I like to write while I'm watching TV. And I actually feel like rather than other books, you get the best dialogue tips from TV
Mm.
because you can see it. And I also think it's much more natural, and it's a lot of that it's funny, it's supposed to get an emotional reaction out of you. And I think that you also get to see what the characters do, like with their hands or their eyebrows while they're saying these lines. And that kind of changes it. But it's so much more natural a lot of the time if it's happening on TV or in a movie. And I'm not saying that dialogue in books isn't natural, but it does have a certain disconnect because you can't see them, obviously, or the things that they're doing with their face, and that you can on TV. And so if you can see them doing it and hear the things that they're saying and hear the tone, I just think that you get a much more realistic depiction of what a character would say in those given situations. So I'd say definitely get your dialogue tips from TV more than or movies more than anything else. But also I'm honestly, I don't have the best advice, but so I recently learned that I have obsessive compulsive disorder. And what this means for me is I think about like doomsday situations for a couple hours a day, like if my dad died,
Hmm.
or if like my husband left or whatever. And so I do this and I would do it all the time, but I'd also do it very cinematically, and I'd play out conversations that would go in those in my head. And if words didn't feel right, I would change them and replay the situation again. So I do think that I kind of have a sad leg up into dialogue because like for most of my life, I've been imagining these scenarios, and if it felt unrealistic, then I would redo it because this is
Mm.
the way that my brain kind of like prepares itself for emotional damage. And if it didn't feel real, then I'm not properly preparing myself. So I've been doing this for many years, and dialogue was always key. And if it felt real. And so I think it's actually practice for like a decade
Yeah.
of imagining real dialogue in my head between not just like random people that maybe like each other, but me and the person I like. Or
Yeah.
And then so it feels real because like what exactly would they say and what would be the thing that they'd say that would hurt me the most or would make me the most excited or make me feel the most special, but also make like if they're a funny person they would obviously do it in a teasing or a joking way, or
Mm-hmm.
if they're a sad person then it would make you reflect on like what they're actually thinking or what they're feeling. And it's just like because I've done this as a way to protect myself, I think my brain is constantly doing that. And so maybe it's
Yeah.
just the dialogue. Yeah, if it didn't feel right, if it didn't feel like something they would say, I would just sit there and daydream about it for hours, like I would in my doomsday scenario, until it felt real, until I was prepared, until it felt right. So it's weird that I'm a pantser, but I'm also constantly daydreaming the dialogue.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You're
especially the
pantsing,
dialogue.
but you're constantly
Daydreaming.
I
Yeah,
but like also
constantly
like
in my
planning in a
imagination.
way. You're
Yes,
like, yeah, you're pantsing it, but you it seems like you constantly are
it's
trying to
always
make
up
sure
here.
it's good. Yeah.
Yes. So I do the Stairmaster a lot, 20 minutes. And that's a
Mm-hmm.
full 20 minutes where I just sit there and I daydream about whatever scene I'm thinking about at the
Mm,
time. And for that entire 20 minutes, I will play dialogue in my head until I get the strongest emotional reaction from it. And then I'm like,
yeah.
there it is. Yeah.
Are you like an act outer dialogue? Like if you're alone, are you like speaking the dialogue out loud or is it just all up there?
Yeah, I've never done that. Thank goodness. I think I would be very embarrassing because a lot of the things, yeah, that I say are like very vulnerable, I would say. Like a lot of the scenes that I'm
Yeah.
imagining are very
Yeah.
vulnerable scenes. And so that's why I will play them over and over and over again. Like Frankie and Ben's date, I probably
Mm,
imagined in my head for 3 weeks before I actually wrote it down. Just being like, well, how I needed it to be like if I were truly on a date with a teenage, well, not teenage. When I originally wrote them, they
yeah.
were teenagers actually, and then I aged them up.
Okay.
Go away. It's my husband. Go away. Good. We're almost done.
I know. I'll wrap it up. I'll wrap it up.
But yeah, I've just been talking forever. But you're just very easy to talk to. I feel like this has been a
Oh,
wonderful
good.
conversation.
I've
But,
loved
so
it.
I would
Loved every second.
yeah, so I would think of like an actual date that I would go on with a young man in his like dinky little car who packed a picnic for you. And the things that he would say that would really touch your heart, but also knowing that this isn't, a guy who you just met or who's trying to get in your pants or who's like a successful finance guy and it's just and it's your best friend.
Mm-hmm.
And I just had to get it right. And so it took
Yeah.
that scene took the most daydreaming, I think, to get it right. To be like, this has to be emotional, but it also has to be funny. And I
Yeah.
also think that speaking of like intimate details like my but I also am a humor defense mechanism deflector person. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, if it's not funny, like I can't do
Yeah.
it. It has something funny in there. So I also think that every single time I write dialogue, I try to make it a little bit funny because I personally, I'm the type of person where I'm like, if I'm not doing some sort of service for you, I'm not
Mm-hmm.
worthy. So I'm like, hey, I can at least like make you laugh. So I think like every bit of
Right.
dialogue needs to be a little funny, and that makes it a little worth something than if it wasn't.
No, that makes sense. I like your tip too about TV and movies because I already said I love reality TV, but I love TV and movies as well. So, do
Yes.
you have any TV or movie recommendations that you love?
I actually think, as far as dialogue, New Girl might be one of the best dialogue
Mm,
wise
yeah,
ever, just because they're constantly like every single one of them is funny and is witty, and they're all very, very different, but they all have chemistry
yeah,
together.
that's
And the
true.
chemistry is important. Like you really have to nail exactly how a person would respond to like the weird thing that person would say.
Yeah,
And you also have to make that worth saying. Like you can't just have dialogue for dialogue, like not just to be funny, but also to give you some character a little bit, a little more background, just like the tiniest bit of background every single time they say something. Because every single time they're reacting, you're learning a little bit more about them. So
hmm,
dialogue should always give you a little bit of insight to a character, even if it's like a three-word sentence. Because a lot of dialogue, especially like, and I love a romance, but I feel like a lot of romance dialogue is more to further the relationship, which I get, but I also think you should learn more about the people saying the words,
yeah,
and that will give it a lot of depth too. Whether it's funny or not, you definitely have to be thinking like, how is the reader going to be learning more about this character in the way that they're saying these things?
yeah. Now I'm gonna go read back the chapters I've been writing and obsess over my dialogue.
Do
This
you
is really
have
helpful
like
though.
Yes, I would like to A, learn more about your writing, but like,
Yeah.
so I'm like, I'm not following you, I don't think. Am I on like any social media things? I would like
I
to. I'd like
honestly
to.
try not to look at it because it stresses me out.
I totally get it. Immediately, yes.
Yep, immediately yes. I don't, I'm doing this YouTube channel and it has kind of like blown up a bit and I love it because I like to talk. So it's really
Mhm.
just me talking to myself about writing, but then it's immediately scary because there's like a lot of people who know
Yeah.
my face and my name and being perceived as weird.
That's exciting
So,
though.
yeah, it's
Yay!
fun.
That's what my
It's
TikTok
mostly
was.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And TikTok is like that can blow up like
It's
overnight.
weird. And then you get like the criticism of like you're
Yeah.
ugly or you're dumb or your opinions suck. I'm like, cool.
You're like, "Oh,
I'm
great.
glad
Thank you."
that I got a moment of fame.
Yep, I'm like, "I don't need this again. Thank you."
But I really would like to keep up with your writing and your journey. Like
Yeah,
that's it. Yeah.
definitely. Yeah,
So,
I'm
okay, I have your
on
email, but if you ever like if you want to
yeah.
like connect and be any sort of like writing group type pals, I would love that because this
I'd love that.
conversation just like it's like preachy. It just spilled out of me and I couldn't shut up for an hour and a half.
No, I love it and I feel like we write like similar things in terms of like character journeys and genre and stuff, so that'd be cool. I'm always down to have more writing friends to
Yay!
sit there and chat about writing because my husband doesn't want to hear it.
Totally, me too. And it's also it's an isolating hobby. So
It
it's good to have
is.
friends. Yeah.
It
It's
is.
not
And
like
I feel like
pickleball.
that can help. Yes. Which is also gaining in
It
popularity
is.
by the
Yes.
day. No, but I think that does. I actually just talked about this on my channel recently that like I have a hard time feeling motivated sometimes with my story, but talking with other writers and then having people be like, "Ooh, this is so cool. Maybe you should think about it this way." And then like
Yeah,
making me think about it intellectually. I'm like, "Okay, wait, no, I do love this idea." I just
right.
needed to like talk about it cuz I'm a chatty Kathy and I'm like
Same.
such an auditory processor when it
Mhm.
comes to my ideas. That's why I asked if you acted out the dialogue because I will sit here and I will auditory
That's
process
amazing. Do you
everything.
change your voice?
Yeah,
I love it.
it is the theater in this office when
That's
I'm
amazing.
doing those scenes. Yes.
Oh, I bet it's so strong. Like, I bet the dialogue's so strong.
I
But
don't
yeah,
know if
if
it's
other people can get
strong.
you excited about it, like just being excited
Yeah,
about it is a huge component about getting
it
a
is.
good piece of writing. Yeah.
Yeah.
And your
And like you
friends
said,
do
it's
that.
hard. It's
Yeah,
hard when like you read something back, you're like, I hate everything. And then that can dampen your excitement. So it is fun to
totally.
like be reminded, like, okay, wait, no, this is like cool and exciting. And even if it's
Yes.
not the best thing ever written, it's still something that I love. So
And it's also, even if you don't necessarily think that it's not the best thing ever written, there's somebody out
yeah,
there who might.
that's
Like,
true.
because I just remember thinking like the sequel Paired isn't going to sell as much as Peachy, and then Buried probably
Mm,
will sell even less, and so like not a lot of people are going to be reading these books, and it's hard to stay motivated also to the third one when you know just statistically they're going to be doing worse as you
yeah,
continue. But at the same time, I'm also getting people still emailing, DMing me, being like, I'm so excited for the third one. Please, like, let me know when it's happening. And just knowing, even if there's just like a few people out there, but they are waiting and they're excited, like, that gets you
yeah,
excited. And it makes you, it's just like, it's such an honor to know that people are out there waiting to read your book.
right.
And it changes,
Yeah.
yeah, everything. Yeah.
Love that. Well, I guess as a parting word, do you have any parting? I know we talked a lot about advice, but do you have any parting advice for maybe just newer authors who are really getting in it and looking for anything to help them stay in it?
I think just finish the book. So many people write it halfway, think it's bad, or just lose momentum or lose interest and then stop. And they will keep talking about it or they'll keep thinking about it forever. And they'll be like, what if I finished it? Like, even if you think it is horrible, even if you don't think anyone will buy it, just finish it. Because once you finish one book, like it's like you can write 100 books. It's just finishing really that first one. That's the biggest hurdle of all
Hmm.
of anything. Even after querying hundreds of agents and publishing houses and writing multiple books and having breakdowns and taking breaks, finishing, even though it's like the editing took me a year, but being like, this is done. Just finishing the first book will make sure that you continue writing, I think, forever. Like once it's there, you're not going to stop knowing that you can do it. So just finish it. And you never know what could happen after that. Like you really don't know. It could be something you did because you love it and your family loves it and your spouse loves it. Or it could be a New York Times bestseller. You have no idea what's going to happen. But either way, do it because you love it, because you're excited, and because you have an idea. And if you have an idea, that's enough.
Yeah.
Write it. Yeah.
I love that. I needed to hear that today as I'm writing this first draft again. Like, you're right. Just
I know
finish.
I'm drafting 3 things because I keep drafting and then
Oh
being
my
like, this
God.
is sucky and switching.
Oh my gosh, I could never switch. I feel for you. I feel like my brain would explode.
Yeah. I just
Yeah.
feel productive even if I'm working on something that's not what I need to be
Yeah,
working on. I'm like, you at least wrote 2 pages of this random short story today,
it's
so
true.
you did something.
Yeah, maybe I should start doing that then. Maybe I should have like a little side
I get some
project.
juices. Yeah, I get some juices
Yeah.
flowing. Yeah.
Yeah.
And sometimes you just got to keep the momentum going a little bit because it's like going to the gym. I go to the gym a lot now because
Yeah.
if I stop for like 2 days, then those 2 days turn into a month, turn into 6 months, turn into a
Yeah.
year.
I feel
And
that
so
as
that's the
well.
same thing with writing. Yeah, I'm like when I initially took my hiatus, I was going to take a week off and then it turned into 6 months. And it's very, very hard to like. So now I'm just like write a page, write a paragraph, just write something. And you did it.
Mhm.
You wrote today.
Yeah. Well, do you want to tell people where they can find you and find your books?
So sure, I have multiple social medias. I'm on Instagram, Blue Sky, I'm on TikTok, and I'm on Threads. I've never checked Threads, but they're all under just Camri Kohler. And then I have a website, camrikohler.com. And but through there, yeah, you can always like submit something like through my website and ask me any question, and that's great. And what was the second question? Oh, my books.
Yeah, where to
Oh, my
find your
books.
books.
So yes, they're at a lot of Barnes and Noble stores, the first 2, and then Amazon, but there's a couple local shops that have them.
Mhm.
There's a little queer indie bookstore here that I'm very happy took my books.
Lovely.
It's called Under the Umbrella, and they're wonderful. It's also so if anyone's in Utah, they're at King's English, they're at Under the Umbrella, they're at the Barnes and Noble and Sugar House, who have been the most wonderful people to me in the whole world over the last 2 years. And I'm like trying to get away from Amazon, but
It's hard.
they're there. Yeah.
It's really
It is
hard.
hard. I have the
Yeah.
membership until
Yeah.
March. It's really hard.
Right. Yeah. So request Camry's books at your library, at your small indie
And they're on
bookstores.
well, they're at least on my, like, Libby, and, Peachy's on
Yeah.
Audible. Paired, I have auditions coming in for the audiobook right now, so it will be on Audible soon.
Ooh, that's gotta be fun. That's like a
It's
whole other
exciting.
aspect I didn't even think
Yeah. So
about.
people will send in, like, 3-minute clips of them reading your book, and you can kind of
So
go through and
cool.
engage. Yes, which is really fun.
Wow. I love that. Well, thank you so much for chatting. I know we chatted a
No,
lot, but
yeah,
this
thank
was
you.
really
I'm so
great.
sorry I just talked your ear off. I
No,
just had
I
so much
loved
fun.
it. Yeah, I had fun too. Yeah, we'll definitely have to stay in touch. This was great.
Yes. Okay, thank you, thank you, thank you. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you so much for listening to another episode of Pen to Pod. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Truly, right after talking with Camri, I instantly started working on my own project because I was just so inspired by our conversation. So I hope that has the same effect for you. We only have one more episode until the end of season 1 for Pen to Pod, and then we will be back for season 2 at the beginning of next year. If you enjoyed this episode or any other episode, please share it with your writer friends, share on social media, leave a review, like and comment if you're watching on YouTube. Any little thing helps reach more writers just like you. Thanks for listening and hope to see you soon. Bye, writers.